You look pretty playing with mud in my backyard, superstar. But I don't care about your commercials or your brand. I care about $75,000 in cash before that sun hits the water tower or your little school comes down.
A man with a silver-plated revolver tucked into his denim waistband walked onto the construction site at Oak Haven Lane with my 5 armed men behind him and demanded $75,000 in cold, hard cash. He wrapped his thick, calloused fingers around the throat of an 18-year-old volunteer named Toby, lifting the boy until his sneakers scraped uselessly against the gravel. He gave the giant in the faded gray hoodie exactly 3 hours to deliver the money. No police sirens, no private security, no defensive weapons. Just a global icon standing in the dust of a ruined warehouse, completely isolated, with a single burner phone in his pocket and a silent calculation running behind his eyes that no one in that perimeter saw coming. There is a forgotten stretch of asphalt in Gary, Indiana, called Oak Haven Lane. Most people who live just 30 minutes away in the clean suburbs of Chicago have never heard the name, and the city council stopped voting on its budget long before the turn of the century. Cracked sidewalks grew weeds thicker than tree roots. Streetlights buzzed with a dying orange hum that did nothing to scare away the shadows. And half the brick storefronts wore rusted iron grates like armor against the night. If you found yourself driving down Oak Haven Lane after the sun dipped below the steel mills, you did not tap your brakes for anything short of a brick wall. Most delivery drivers locked their cabin doors and drove straight through the red lights without looking back. On the corner of Oak Haven and 4th Street, an abandoned textile factory 5 stories tall had been rotting since the late 80s. Every single pane of glass had been reduced to jagged teeth inside the window frames, and local street gangs had layered their territorial spray paint so thick on the masonry that the original red brick was entirely buried. For nearly 20 years, that massive concrete carcass just sat there in the damp Midwestern air, smelling of stagnant rain and burnt rubber, serving as a monument to every political promise that had ever been made to the residents of Gary and quietly broke before the ink dried. But something shifted inside that skeletal structure during the humid summer months that one particular man refused to let go of. It was not because of the physical danger that eventually found him there, though blood was nearly spilled on the concrete. It was not even about the $75,000 that hung in the balance of a madman's pride. It was because of what those tense hours taught him about the invisible line between reacting with anger and thinking with strategic patience. He learned the uncomfortable truth that when a man possesses the power to destroy his enemy with a single word, the truest victory is choosing a path where the enemy destroys himself. That man was LeBron James. The entire world recognized him as the billionaire athlete, the cultural titan who commanded stadium lights and corporate boardrooms across the globe. He could have spent his off-season behind the monitored iron gates of a Brentwood mansion, shielded by a small army of publicists, and eating at private clubs where a single reservation cost more than a factory worker's monthly mortgage. But that was never his blueprint. He remembered the cold apartments of his own youth, the constant moving from one couch to another, and the terrifying weight of growing up in a neighborhood where tomorrow was never a guarantee. He understood the desperate need for a single open door, a safe floor with a basketball hoop, and a room where a kid could study without hearing the gunfire outside. He had come to Oak Haven Lane not for a ribbon-cutting ceremony or a television crew, but to build a fortress of hope with his own calloused hands. But nobody in that room understood what was actually written on that faded piece of paper yet. The morning sun over Gary did not clear the horizon with a golden glow. It struggled through a thick curtain of gray industrial haze that drifted from the remaining active furnaces along the lake. Inside the cavernous belly of the old textile plant, the air was dense with the smell of damp mortar, powdered lime, and the metallic tang of oxyacetylene torches cutting through structural steel. Pigeons fluttered blindly near the high rafters 50 feet above, disturbed by the rhythmic, echoey thud of hammers, striking ancient cinder blocks. Water from an unresolved leak in the old roof dripped rhythmically onto a cracked concrete slab, creating a small pool that reflected the flickering, fluorescent work lights strung across the framing. Every morning at precisely 5:45, before the first bakery on the corner unbolted its heavy iron security doors, LeBron would roll onto Oakhaven Lane. He did not arrive in a chauffeured SUV with tinted ballistic glass or a convoy of security details clearing the perimeter. He drove a weathered, midnight black pickup truck with a dented tailgate and a rusted toolbox bolted behind the cabin, wearing a heavy canvas work jacket and jeans that were stiff with dried cement powder. His boots were so deeply worn, from months of walking over rebar and broken brick, that the rubber treads were nearly smooth at the heels. He worked with a methodical, quiet intensity that stunned the local contractors who had been hired to manage the complex structural framing. He did not stand in the center of the room with a clipboard, shouting directions or pointing fingers at blueprints while others broke their backs. He carried 80-pound bags of concrete mix 2 at a time, his massive shoulders straining against the fabric of his faded shirt, and mixed the gray sludge in plastic tubs until his hands were raw and stained. During the midday heat, when the air inside the unventilated warehouse became nearly suffocating, he would sit directly on the curb outside with the rest of the crew, his back resting against a stack of drywall sheets. He ate cold turkey sandwiches wrapped in wax paper from the corner bodega, laughing quietly at the jokes of middle-aged carpenters who simply called him corporate or big guy. But while the internal rhythm of the construction site was defined by hard work and shared sweat, the external rhythm of Oakhaven Lane was watching them through a lens of profound suspicion. Damon Miller, known on the streets simply as Vance, had been observing the daily transformation of the textile factory from the second-floor window of an illegal gambling den across the street. Vance was a man constructed entirely of sharp angles and cold calculation, standing 6 feet 3 inches with a face hardened by 2 decades of surviving the brutal hierarchy of Gary's underground economies. He had watched local politicians hold press conferences in front of that very building 3 different times over the last 15 years. Promises of urban renewal flashing in their eyes before they climbed back into their clean cars and never returned. To Vance, this massive billionaire athlete moving concrete blocks was not an act of pure altruism or community redemption. It was a carefully staged corporate performance designed for a sneaker commercial. He saw a man whose wealth was so immense that a $75,000 extortion fee would feel like a dropped quarter on a sidewalk. He believed that people from LeBron's world only understood one language when confronted with real-world friction, and that was the language of throwing money at all problem until the discomfort disappeared. Vance adjusted his heavy gold signet ring, watched LeBron wipe sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve, and decided that the Hollywood circus had played on his territory for long enough without paying the rent. Every long hour spent inside that skeletal warehouse was guided by an old memory that LeBron carried beneath his skin like a permanent scar. As he smoothed the wet gray mortar along the edge of a new retaining wall, his fingers brushed against a deep, jagged fissure in the ancient foundation block. That cold, rough texture instantly dragged his mind back 30 years to a cramped apartment on the west side of Akron, where the winter wind whistled through identical cracks in the bedroom drywall. He remembered the sound of his mother's heavy, exhausted sighs as she counted crumbled single-dollar bills on a plastic kitchen table. wondering if the heating bill would get paid before the snow began to accumulate on the fire escape outside. He recalled the terrifying weight of uncertainty that settled over a 10-year-old boy who had to pack his entire life into 2 black garbage bags every 4 months because the rent was overdue again. There were no mentors in those dark hallways, no community centers with polished wooden floors, and no safe havens where a child could escape the predatory rhythms of the concrete grid. The streets then were controlled by older men who looked exactly like Vance. Men who wore expensive leather jackets purchased with the stolen futures of the boys who watched them from the front steps. Basketball had not been a path to luxury or a $1 million corporate contract in those early days. It was simply a heavy leather shield that kept him from looking at the corners where the shadows waited. He looked across the dusty floor of the warehouse toward a weathered equipment crate, where a single leather basketball sat resting against a stack of iron rebar. The leather of that ball was deeply split and faded to a dull charcoal gray, its black seams worn down until they were nearly flush with the rubber surface. It was the exact model his mother had bought him for his 12th birthday, saving for 6 weeks by skipping lunches at the dry cleaners, where she worked until her knuckles bled. That object was his true north, a silent reminder that the massive empire he built later was meant to serve a purpose far larger than his own comfort or the accumulation of championship rings. The local workers saw a global icon sacrificing his physical energy on a forgotten block in Gary. But LeBron was simply paying a debt to the boy he used to be. He knew that if a place like this had existed on his street 30 years ago, half the friends he lost to the federal penitentiary system might still be standing next to him today. He was not building a mere structure of brick and mortar. He was engineering a sanctuary where the cycle of poverty and fear could be systematically broken from the inside out. He stood up slowly, his knees popping under the immense strain of his frame, and wiped the gray stone dust from his palms with a patience that could survive any storm. The iron security gates at the entrance of the warehouse did not just open. They groaned against the concrete floor as Vance's 5 men kicked them aside with a brutal, deliberate lack of care. The collective sound of internal combustion engines died instantly as the construction crew turned off their heavy saws and drills. The sudden silence inside the 5-story structure becoming so dense it felt almost physical. Vance walked through dusty air with the slow, rhythmic stride of a landlord, inspecting an apartment whose tenants were 3 months behind on their obligations to his pocketbook. He stopped directly in front of the equipment crate where the faded split-skin basketball sat, looking down at it for a fraction of a second before lifting his polished leather dress shoe and kicking it across the floor. The old ball rolled erratically through the gray cement powder, leaving a dull track in the dust before striking a rusted iron beam and coming to a dead stop. None of the 10 workers moved a muscle, their tools remaining frozen in their hands as Vance's men spread out along the perimeter of the room, their hands resting loosely near their jackets. LeBron did not step down from the low wooden scaffolding immediately. He slowly placed his heavy steel trowel onto a clean brick, wiped his fingers on a rag, and descended the steps without a single trace of urgency. He stood at his full height of 6 feet 9 inches, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow across the concrete floor that completely enveloped Vance's smaller silhouette. Yet, despite the immense physical disparity between the 2 men, the atmosphere in the room froze as Vance tilted his head back, an arrogant, dry laugh escaping his throat as he scanned LeBron's dust-covered clothes. "You look real pretty in that dirty hoodie, superstar," Vance said, his voice carrying an artificial warmth that made the skin on the back of the workers' necks prickle with immediate instinct. "A man with your kind of bank account playing with mud in my backyard, like he's trying to win a medal for being a regular citizens from the old block. I don't care about your commercials. And I don't care about whatever tax write-off your lawyers told you to build in this forgotten zip code to make your brand look saintly. I care about $75,000 in cash, delivered to the gambling house across the asphalt, before the sun hits the top of that rusted water tower, or this roof comes down. LeBron looked down at Vance, his dark eyes completely unblinking, his massive chest rising and falling, with a slow, rhythmic breathing that showed no sign of adrenaline. Every dollar allocated for this textile plant is locked inside a registered municipal nonprofit charter, LeBron said, his voice low and scraping against the quiet walls like gravel under a boot. There is no corporate cash hidden in these supply crates, and there is no private funding to split with a man who spends his days squeezing the local grocery stores. If I give you a single dime today, you show up at the front doors next winter when the kids are trying to learn, and the cycle never ends. Vance's jaw tightened, the skin around his knuckles, turning a dangerous shade of gray as he stepped within 3 inches of LeBron's chest, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne mixing uncomfortably with the smell of wet cement. He did not look up at LeBron's face. He turned his gaze toward Toby, who was standing trembling next to a pile of drywall sheets, with a plastic water pitcher in his small hands. Toby was 18, his oversized gray sweatshirt hanging off his thin shoulders, his face pale with the realization that the man standing before him was the same person who controlled the midnight streets. "This place isn't for some rich corporate board," Toby whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he took a small step forward, trying to find his courage in front of the giant athlete he had worshipped since childhood. "My little sister is supposed to come here after school, so she doesn't have to walk past the dark alleys on 4th Street, and you live here too, so you know what happens to those girls." Vance didn't answer with words. His right arm moved like a strike from a hidden snake, his thick fingers locking around the collar and throat of Toby's sweatshirt before the boy could even blink. He lifted the teenager completely off the concrete slab with one arm, pressing him against a wooden support beam until the boy's sneakers kicked uselessly 12 inches above the gravel. Toby's hands flew to Vance's iron wrist, his fingers clawing at the gold signet ring, his breath coming in short, suffocating gasps as the plastic water pitcher shattered against the floorboards. "Did I ask for a speech from a child who doesn't even own the shoes on his feet?" Vance growled, his face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated malice, as his men took a step closer, their eyes warning the older carpenters to stay back. LeBron closed the 3-foot distance between them in 2 measured, silent steps, his massive hands remaining completely open at his sides, showing no aggressive posture but carrying an energy that made Vance's lead enforcer reach into his waistband. "Let the boy go," LeBron said, the words falling into the room with the weight of an iron vault door closing. "He is 18 years old. He is a volunteer who lives 4 doors down from here, and he has nothing to do with whatever financial narrative you think you are spinning. This conversation belongs entirely to you and me. So take your hand off his throat before the air in this room changes into something you cannot survive." Vance held Toby for one more agonizing second, his eyes searching LeBron's face for a flicker of panic, a sign of anger, or the sudden defensive movement of a man about to throw a punch. But he found nothing but an icy, ancient stillness that made his own stomach turn, with a sudden, unexpected drop of hesitation. Vance opened his fingers, and Toby collapsed to the floor in a heap, coughing violently as he clutched his neck, his eyes wide with a terror that would take months to wash away. 3 hours, Superstar, Vance said, wiping his palm on his silk trousers as he turned back toward the rusted gates. 3 hours, or the young volunteer doesn't make it to his portion tonight, and this warehouse becomes a chimney. The sound of their heavy boots faded down Oak Haven Lane, leaving the 10 construction workers standing in a cowering, silent circle around the broken water pitcher. LeBron did not curse. He did not smash his fists against the unfinished brickwork, and he did not reach into his pocket to call the local precinct. He walked over to the corner, picked up the faded charcoal gray basketball, and sat down on a stack of rough cinder blocks, his mind entering a state of absolute, hyper-focused isolation while the midday sun began to cook the asphalt outside. The silence that settled over the unfinished textile warehouse after Vance's departure was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that occurs right before a summer tornado touches down on the open plains. LeBron remained seated on the rough stack of cinder blocks for nearly 10 minutes, his massive hands resting flat on his knees, his eyes fixed on the white chalk lines drawn across the concrete floorboards. The 10 construction workers watched him from a distance, exchanging hushed, panicked whispers, while Toby sat on an empty crate, his breath still coming in ragged, shallow gasps as he rubbed the dark red marks forming on his neck. They were waiting for the superstar to break, waiting for him to order his luxury truck to be packed so he could retreat back to the safety of his monitored world, leaving them to face the midnight wrath of the local syndicate. But the mental architecture of a champion does not operate on the field of panic or immediate emotional reaction. LeBron stood up slowly, his towering frame straight, his face carrying the unreadable, icy composure of a general who had already seen the end of the battle before the first shot was fired. He walked out of the main hall and stepped into the small, rusted office trailer parked near the back fence, closing the thin aluminum door behind him to block out the hum of the street. He reached into his canvas jacket, pulled out a simple black burner phone that carried no corporate logos or tracking software, and dialed a private 10-digit number that only 3 people in the entire country possessed. The line clicked open on the second ring, revealing the quiet, static-free breathing of a man sitting in a soundproof room. "This is Carter," a low, gravelly voice said from the speaker. "I have a critical operational friction at the Gary Inchdush site," LeBron said, his tone perfectly flat, devoid of any adrenaline or fear, as if he were reading a financial spreadsheet to a board of directors. A local syndicate operator named Vance just crossed the perimeter with 5 armed enforcers. He is demanding $75,000 in physical cash within a 3-hour window, and he has placed an immediate physical threat against an 18-year-old local volunteer and the structure itself. There was a 3-second pause on the other end of the line, the sound of computer keys tapping softly in the background. "Are you in immediate physical jeopardy?" Carter asked. "No," LeBron replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the security camera feed playing on a small monitor inside the trailer. "I have the physical leverage for now, but a direct physical confrontation on this grid will destroy the community asset and put these 10 local workers in permanent danger after I depart. I need a strategic isolation window established within 45 minutes, no kinetic weapons, no physical injuries, and 0 municipal law enforcement involvement on the primary objective. I need a dense social pocket where his local territorial authority becomes completely non-existent." "I understand," Carter said, his voice remaining cool, reflecting his 12 years of managing high-profile corporate security and counter-surveillance infrastructure across the Midwest. The downtown commercial district of Indianapolis, near the Meridian Financials on East Market Street, is currently entering its peak midday business rush. The streets are gridlocked with corporate professionals, delivery trucks, and high-density pedestrian traffic. I have a specialized 6-man team operating 2 blocks from that location with an armored transport vehicle and a commercial delivery van. We can engineer a localized structural traffic anomaly that will appear completely organic to any external observer. If you can pull him onto that specific grid, He will be completely separated from his domestic support network within 30 minutes. I will initiate the movement now, LeBron said, closing the phone and slipping it back into his pocket. He walked out of the trailer, his expression completely unchanged, and approached the nervous project manager who was holding a blueprint with trembling fingers. Keep every worker inside the main hall with the iron doors bolted from the inside, LeBron ordered quietly. Do not allow anyone to depart alone, and do not contact the local precinct. I am executing a containment protocol now. Trust the process, keep your hands on your tools, and act as if nothing has occurred. Then, performing an act of absolute psychological nerve, LeBron walked back to the unfinished brick wall, picked up his heavy steel trowel, and began smoothing a fresh layer of gray mortar along the masonry line. His hands were perfectly steady, his movements rhythmic and precise, working with the calm dedication of a man who knew that the greatest weapon against chaos was a display of absolute, unshakable order. Exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes later, the roar of Vance's black sedans echoed down Oakhaven Lane as they pulled up to the curb, their tires kicking up small clouds of dry gray dirt. Vance stepped out of the passenger side, his silk tie fluttering slightly in the industrial breeze, his eyes instantly tracking LeBron, who was just stepping out of the warehouse entrance, with a heavy leather portfolio tucked under his massive arm. Vance smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth that showed he expected to see a broken man ready to hand over a bag of untraceable bills. Got up my 75,000, superstar? Or am I sending my boys inside to clean out the volunteers? Vance asked, his hand drifting toward the silver-plated revolver beneath his waistband. The money is not sitting in a supply crate in Gary, LeBron said, his voice completely level as he stood by the driver's side of his weathered pickup truck, his eyes locking onto Vance with absolute stillness. This entire restoration project is underwritten by the Apex Financial Trust, located at the Meridian Center in downtown Indianapolis. The chief trustee, an investment executive named Sterling Vance, controls the physical wire transfers and municipal bonds for the foundation. I informed him of your local territory requirements, and he is prepared to settle the transaction directly with you at his private club. Vance narrowed his eyes, his criminal instincts instantly searching for the hidden angle, the telltale twitch in the giant's jaw, or a sign of tactical deception. Why can't you just write a personal check, James? You make more in a week than this entire neighborhood sees in a decade. Every dollar connected to my name is monitored by federal auditors and public corporate compliance teams, LeBron answered, holding Vance's gaze without a single blink. I don't carry $75,000 in a duffel bag like a street dealer. If you want the capital, you sit across from a man who signs the city contracts. He knows you have controlled this zone for 20 years, and he understands that nothing moves on Oakhaven Lane without your signature. He respects leverage, Vance. That last sentence landed with the precision of a perfectly timed pass. It did not just appeal to Vance's greed. It struck the deep, aching vanity that had driven him to terrorize his own neighborhood for 2 decades. He spent his entire life being ignored by the white-collar suits who ran the state, treated like an invisible infection in a forgotten city. The idea of an elite Wall Street investor recognizing his local authority, wanting to sit down with him as an equal power broker, was a drug he could not refuse. We follow your truck, Vance growled, turning back toward his enforcers. But if we pull up to a federal building or a police precinct, your little volunteer, Toby, doesn't make it home for dinner. LeBron nodded once, climbed into his truck, and pulled away from the curb with Vance's 2 black sedans, tailing him like a pair of dark sharks through the gray streets of Gary. The drive south toward Indianapolis took nearly 45 minutes, a tense, silent journey where LeBron kept his speed precisely at the legal limit, signaling every turn with absolute normalcy. Inside the cabin, He wasn't looking at the road. He was counting the mile markers, tracking the shrinking distance between his location and the invisible trap Carter had prepared. As the pickup truck crossed into the high-density financial district of downtown Indianapolis, the architecture changed from rusted steel structures to towering glass monoliths that scraped the blue Midwestern sky. The streets were swarming with thousands of corporate employees on their lunch break, luxury vehicles waiting at crosswalks, and high-end delivery vans blocking the curbs. LeBron turned onto East Market Street, his rearview mirror showing Vance's two sedans pinned closely behind him, their dark windows completely out of place among the clean business crowds. Suddenly, 50 yards ahead of LeBron's bumper, a massive white commercial delivery van pulled out from an alleyway and stalled completely dead across both active lanes of traffic. A yellow taxi behind it slammed on its brakes, its horn erupting in a long, furious blast, while a heavy armored transport vehicle pulled up on the left side, boxing the entire intersection into an artificial gridlock. Within 15 seconds, East Market Street was transformed into an impenetrable parking lot of metal, steam, and shouting drivers. It looked like the most ordinary, frustrating infrastructure failure in the history of downtown commuting, but to LeBron, it was a beautifully executed symphony of containment. LeBron twisted his steering wheel hard to the right, slipping his pickup truck into a narrow stone-walled delivery alleyway that he had memorized years ago during an endorsement shoot. The truck fit with only inches to spare on either side, sliding through the shadows of the skyscrapers, turning left onto Washington Street, and disappearing into the clean flow of outbound traffic. Clean, smooth, gone. Behind him, Vance's enforcer slammed his palms against the steering wheel of the lead sedan as the exit vanished from his view. They were completely locked in, surrounded on all four sides by buses, luxury sports cars, and an ocean of angry pedestrians. Vance threw his passenger door open, his polished leather shoes striking the clean asphalt as he stood up, his eyes wild with sudden, frantic rage. He looked down the narrow alleyway, but LeBron's truck was already 2 blocks away. He turned back toward the gridlock, his hand instinctively reaching for the silver-plated revolver in his waistband, but his arm froze solid as his eyes took in the surrounding environment. A female corporate lawyer standing on the sidewalk directly next to his door had her smartphone raised, recording his aggressive movements for a social media broadcast. 2 tech executives in expensive suits were staring at his sharp, thuggish attire, speaking rapidly into their Bluetooth headsets while gesturing toward his vehicle. At the far end of the intersection, a pair of bright blue municipal police cruisers were sitting with their lights flashing, their officers already stepping onto the pavement to investigate the disturbance. Vance stood in the middle of the clean, sunlit street and felt a wave of cold water wash over his spine. This was not the dark, forgotten turf of Oakhaven Lane, where the residents hid behind closed blinds and the police turned a blind eye to his violence. Here, in the heart of the capital's financial engine, his physical intimidation was completely meaningless. He wasn't a terrifying warlord. He was just a loud, suspicious man in a cheap suit being recorded by corporate bystanders, who would hand the footage to the district attorney before the sun went down. His lead lieutenant grabbed his shoulder from behind, his voice trembling with immediate panic. "Vance, get back in the vehicle right now. There are too many cameras. The cops are walking this way." The drive back to Gary was conducted in a suffocating, violent silence that no one in the 2 black sedans dared to break. Vance sat in the front seat with his jaw locked so tight. The muscles in his cheeks were trembling, his eyes staring blankly at the cracked asphalt of the highway as the clean glass towers of Indianapolis receded into the gray industrial fog. He had walked into the Meridian Financial Center anyway, driven by a desperate, childish hope that maybe the rich investor was real. that maybe the $75,000 was actually waiting on a mahogany desk. But the polished security guards at the glass doors had looked at his clothes, checked their digital screens, and quietly asked him to leave the premises before they initiated a trespass protocol. He had been tricked, led across the state like a leashed animal by a man who didn't even raise his voice, and his own enforcers had watched the entire performance. At 11:45 that night, Vance sat alone in the back room of his Oak Haven gambling den, a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon resting on the table next to his silver-plated revolver. The single fluorescent light bulb, hanging from the ceiling, flickered rhythmically, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Suddenly, the burner phone sitting on the green felt table began to vibrate, its dull hum cutting through the quiet room like an alarm. Vance snatched the device, pressing it to his ear with a knuckles-white grip. "You think you are clever, superstar," Vance hissed, his voice raw with a humiliation that had been cooking inside his chest for 12 hours. "You looked me in my face, lied to me, and paraded me in front of those city suits just to make a joke out of my name on the streets. I did what was necessary to ensure that every volunteer and worker on that site returned to their families in absolute safety," LeBron's voice said, falling through the receiver with the cold, unyielding weight of an iron vault. "I gave you an opportunity to see the world beyond your 4 blocks, Vance, but you chose to look at a room full of children's dreams and see a payday." Vance grabbed the revolver from the table, his fingers digging into the checkered grip. "You think because you ran into an alleyway you are safe in this city? I control these corners, and by tomorrow morning, that textile plant will be nothing but a pile of black ash and melted steel. You are running a calculation based on an old system that no longer exists," LeBron replied, his tone remaining perfectly calm, entirely devoid of anger or defensive bravado. "I don't possess a crew of soldiers, Vance, and I don't carry weapons in my waistband. But I possess an asset that your entire network cannot survive, and it is the power of absolute illumination. I have already compiled the video footage from downtown, the documentation of your extortion attempt, and the physical report of your assault on an 18-year-old local resident." LeBron paused, the sound of his slow, measured breathing carrying an icy certainty across the digital line. "One single communication from my corporate office to the federal directors in Chicago, and the spotlight turns on over Oak Haven Lane. By tomorrow noon, every major news camera in the state will be parked on your block, and federal investigators will begin pulling the financial threads of your entire operation. Every business you squeeze, every gambling house you run, and every illegal distribution line you control will be dismantled under an administrative light that you cannot extinguish. I am not offering a threat, Vance. I am presenting the physical reality of your choices and allowing you to decide your own future." The silence that followed was long, dense, and heavy with the sudden, terrifying realization that the math had completely changed. Vance looked down at the silver revolver in his hand, a weapon that had kept him alive for 20 years on the dark asphalt, and realized it was completely useless against a man who could command the attention of the entire country with a single gesture. The power he had spent his entire adult life building was designed to operate exclusively in the shadows, and LeBron had just promised to bring the sun. "This isn't finished," Vance whispered, but the words left his lips flat and empty, stripped of the arrogant bark that had terrified the neighborhood for 2 decades. "I sincerely hope it is," LeBron said quietly, "for the sake of the kids who need that floor tomorrow morning." The line went dead, leaving Vance alone in the dim light of the back room, the heavy silence of Oak Haven Lane pressing against his ears like cold water. 4 months passed like water moving through a concrete channel. The Oak Haven textile warehouse was no longer a skeletal ruin. Its brickwork had been pressure washed, Its new double-paned windows caught the afternoon light, and the deep thud of basketballs bouncing on a polished maple floor could be heard from 2 blocks away. LeBron sat in the back booth of a small, quiet diner on the southern edge of Gary, where the vinyl seats were patched with duct tape and the menu had not changed its prices since the mid-90s. He was eating a plate of simple pasta, a thick paperback book, propped against the sugar shaker, when the bell above the front door jingled and the internal temperature of the room shifted. Vance walked in alone. He didn't have his 5 armed enforcers waiting by the coat racks, and his black sedans were not idling at the curb with the windows down. He wore a plain canvas jacket instead of his sharp silk suits. His hands were visible and open at his sides, and the aggressive, theatrical posture that had defined his presence on Oakhaven Lane was entirely gone. He stopped at the edge of the booth, his eyes looking down at LeBron's massive frame with a quiet, exhausted hesitation that looked like a man who had argued with himself for miles before stepping through the door. "Mind if I take a seat, James?" Vance asked, his voice noticeably quieter, stripped of the sharp street bark that had once made the contractors freeze in their tracks. LeBron looked at Vance's open hands, noted the absence of the silver revolver in his waistband, and nodded once toward the opposite vinyl bench. "Sit down, Vance." The small diner sounds filled the space between them. For a moment, the rattle of a coffee pot, the low murmur of the cook behind the grill, and the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Vance rested his forearms on the table, his fingers tracing a deep scratch in the laminate surface, before he finally raised his eyes to meet LeBron's unblinking gaze. "My sister's youngest girl started going to that center you finished, on 4th Street, Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly confession. "She's 14, and she came home last Friday, telling her mother that it's the first time in her life she walked home from school without checking over her shoulder every 10 yards. She's learning digital design in one of those back rooms you funded." LeBron listened without interrupting, his hands resting flat on the table, allowing the weight of Vance's words to settle completely into the quiet booth. "I grew up 3 doors down from that exact building," Vance continued, shaking his head slowly as a bitter, tight smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second. "Nobody built a single thing for us when we were 14. I spent my winters with holes in the bottom of my sneakers because my mother couldn't clear the electricity bill, and every suit who ever came through here promising infrastructure development vanished before the television cameras finished rolling. When my people told me a billionaire Hollywood athlete was moving concrete on Oakhaven, I didn't see a charity project. I saw another wealthy outsider use my neighborhood as a marketing prop before flying back to a mansion." Vance paused, his shoulders dropping an inch lower as he took a slow, heavy breath. "I was entirely wrong about the blueprint, James. People who have seen every promise broken for 20 years have every right to protect their borders with suspicion," LeBron said, his voice soft, but carrying an immense structural resonance. "Trust isn't something you perch with a corporate check or a press release. It's something you earn by showing up when the cameras aren't turned on. You ran those streets for 2 decades, telling yourself you were the law, telling yourself you were keeping the grid together," Vance whispered, staring out the window at the gray industrial skyline. "But you stepped onto that asphalt for 4 months with a canvas jacket and a pile of bricks. And you did more for the actual survival of the children on my block than I managed to achieve in 20 years of enforcing fear. That is a terrifyingly heavy ledger to sit with when the sun goes down." "The truest test was never about who controlled the territory, Vance," LeBron said, stretching his hand across the table, his massive palm open, in a gesture of simple human recognition. "It was always about what you chose to construct with the influence you possessed." Vance looked at LeBron's calloused hand for 3 long seconds, the internal battle clear behind his eyes before he finally reached out and took it. The handshake was brief, firm, and entirely devoid of theatricality, an unspoken contract between two men who finally understood the true layout of the land. Vance stood up, adjusted his canvased jacket, and looked down at the superstar one last time. "We aren't allies, James," Vance said, his jaw setting with a quiet dignity. "I know," LeBron replied, closing his paperback book. "But we aren't enemies either." Vance nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked out of the diner, his silhouette disappearing into the falling Midwestern mist without looking back. The official opening of the Oakhaven Youth Center did not feature a red carpet, a row of flashing media cameras, or a line of politicians eager to claim credit for the transformation. It began on a crisp Saturday morning with the simple, heavy unbolting of the front iron doors, allowing 45 children from the surrounding blocks to stream inside, their eyes wide with the careful, hesitant wonder of people stepping into a sanctuary they weren't entirely sure was built for them. It was built for them, every single hand-laid brick, every polished square inch of the hardwood court, and every textbook lining the quiet study rooms upstairs. Toby was there, wearing a staff lanyard over a clean sweatshirt, his neck completely healed, his face bright with a dignity that had been forged in the dust of that very floor. 2 years later, Vance was swept up in a comprehensive federal investigation targeting the underground gambling and protection rackets across northern Indiana, resulting in a 12-year sentence at a federal correctional facility. During the sentencing hearing, the public defense attorney noted a specific detail that went entirely unrecorded by the local press. Several years prior to his arrest, Vance had systematically and voluntarily removed all extortion targets from community spaces and non-profit organizations within the Gary district. He had quietly chosen to shrink his own financial border, sacrificing a portion of his street revenue to ensure that the sanctuary on 4th Street remained completely untouched by the shadow of his old world. In prison, unconfirmed institutional reports suggested he had begun leading a mentorship circle for younger inmates, financial literacy and structural planning to boys who were trying to figure out how to survive the grid without picking up a weapon. LeBron read the short paragraph about the trial in a local newspaper while sitting in the quiet cabin of his truck, the midday sun warming the dashboard. He did not smile, he did not claim a moral victory, and he did not share the clipping with his corporate public relations team. He simply folded the paper and placed it in his glove compartment with the quiet patience of a man who understood how real change operates. On the high equipment shelf overlooking the main court of the Oakhaven Center, the faded split-skin charcoal gray basketball still sat in its permanent place of honor. It remained completely untouched by the new polished leather balls below, its worn seams a silent monument to the boy from Akron, who refused to run, and the king who chose to build instead of fight. Sometimes, the truest measure of a man's strength is not the violence he can inflict with his hands, but the light he leaves behind when he steps out of the room.